Wonderful. It started. I've got the message. Well, thank you so much for inviting me today. It's great to be with you. As you can see, and as you know, I'm going to talk a little bit about clinical research and what that involves. Before I start, could you have any of you been involved in research studies? Could you do the thumbs up if you've been involved in research studies? Can I just see anybody at all? No, I don't think any of you have. Okay, that's fair enough. So just a bit of background from me. So I spent 25 years doing clinical research, mostly in Sheffield, but also in Bath. I then went and became a charity chief executive, developing assistive technology for 9 years. And then I spent a final 4 years before partly retiring, working with innovators with the Health Innovation Service. So I've seen things from the health service side and from the innovator side and also from the industry side. So let's see if the slides work. So this is the outline. I'm going to talk a bit about the research and development pathway, and we're just going to think a bit about what is good research. And we're going to be using the chat. So if you've got your keyboards to hand, that's great. We're going to talk a little bit about making sure research is safe. Why does it take so long to get research from the lab into clinical practice? And then a couple of weeks ago, we had a stroke network research meeting, and I'm going to try and summarize some of the presentations from that meeting for you, so you can get an idea of what's going on locally. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about how you could get involved in research. So does that sound okay? Can I have thumbs up if that's okay? Yeah, fantastic, wonderful. Oh, wonderful. Oh, I like the bursting thumbs. Lots of great stuff. So, lovely. So this is a typical circle, starting with number 1 at the bottom, about what's involved in a research project. And I'll just talk you through, because I don't know if you can all see the screen quite so well. So first of all, we have identifying the subject of the project. And then we review the existing literature. So those are publications in scientific journals around the topic. So we need to make sure that nobody else has done the work that we're thinking of doing. And then we create some sort of hypothesis. So, will this drug, we think this drug will help improve blood flow for people who've had an ischemic stroke, for example. So we create a hypothesis, and then we design some sort of research study about how we might test that. Of course, we have to work out who we're going to test that on. So who's the population? So it could be on humans, but very often for drug research, it might be start off with some animal studies or some cells in a little petri dish. You gather data. That might take a long time. You analyze the data, and then you write a report. So that's typically what you think about running a research project. However, a bit like an iceberg, that's only the tip above the surface that you see. There's a lot more going on underneath the surface that you don't see. So the first thing is, very often it's very unusual now to do the research on your own. Mostly you need a research team around you, and that could be other senior investigators who are contributing to the ideas and the work, or it could be the technical team behind the scenes or the laboratory staff. So you need to make sure you've got your research team in place. You can also think about, do you have the facilities? So if you're going to be manufacturing some prototypes, how you're going to do that? Do you have the laboratories and workshops to do that? You need to think how much your proposal is going to cost. So a minimum period of time would be a year for a very short project, or it could be up to 6 years or more for big projects. And you need to think about the costs of employing all the technical and research staff and your time. And some research proposals involving multiple universities, I'm involved in one called the Vivo Hub project, and that's £12 million. and that's about 6 universities over 12 over sorry 6 universities over 6 years. So that's a very big study. Now, the university or the hospital won't just allow anybody to submit a research proposal. You have to get approval to submit a research proposal if you're asking for money, and that can take quite a bit of time while the university or the hospital or whoever says, yes, this research looks okay, you can submit it. And then that's the challenging bit. You've got to apply for funding. And this is where it gets really, really difficult. And we're going to talk a bit about funding schemes in a few minutes. But typically you would write up your proposal, and it could be anything from as short as 6 pages to 20 pages. And basically you have to say what you're going to do. So you have to fill in all of these blocks that we've got on the screen here and say what your hypothesis is, how you've designed it, who the population is, how you're going to get the data, how you're going to analyze the data, and how you're going to disseminate it. So the funding body will look at this, and they'll send it out to what we call independent reviewers. And these are other scientists and lay people, so people perhaps who've got lived experience of stroke or whatever. They'll send the application out and they'll say, what do you think of this application? Do you think it stands up, or is it ropey, or are there other things that have been missed? Do you think it's good value for money? Do you think it will have impact? And they will say yes or no, and we'll fund it. To give you an idea, for some of the Research Council funding, you can submit it. It won't get reviewed until 3 months down the line. It then takes 3 months to get the reviews together. You'll then hear the outcome, and then you might say, okay, yes, you can start in 3 months' time. So it can be a year between submitting your proposal, putting it in the post, or pressing the return button, and getting your research funding if you're lucky. So you'll spend a long time writing the research proposal, and it's not quite as bad as winning the lottery, but you might only have maybe 1 in 20 or 1 in 50 chance of getting funded. And so you can see it's quite a long and potentially disappointing process to get the money for your research. Once you've got your funding, you need to recruit your team, so recruit the people to do the work. And you also need to get ethics approval, and we'll talk a bit about that in a little while, but any research involving human subjects has to be reviewed independently to make sure it's safe and ethical, and that can take quite a long time, possibly a couple of months. Once you've done the work, and as we've said, it can be, the research studies can be 1 year, 3 years, 6 years, you then look at writing up the report and getting your results published. And having your results published in a scientific journal, which is again reviewed by peers, is really important. And nobody will accept research that's just put on the internet. It has to be reviewed in a scientific and published and accepted by a scientific journal, so that people know the results are reliable and that have been reviewed. And then after you've done
So I'm going to interrupt you there and just say, I guess then that's interesting, because there's so much stuff on the internet now.
Yeah.
So, for it just makes me think, for something to be reliable, we should be looking for it to have been published and cited, it'll say published in a journal at the end of whatever it is.
Exactly, that's exactly right, Gemma. Or it's been posted by somebody who you know is reliable, like the National Institute for Health Research,
Okay.
or the Stroke Association, or whatever. But yeah, really important.
Yeah, thank you.
And as we're going to see in a little while, to exploit or commercialize your results can also take a really long time. So it's actually tough being a researcher, and I really enjoyed it, and I love research. But if you said to me, Nigel, would you recommend anybody becomes a researcher? Would you recommend this as a career for anybody? And I'd frankly say probably no. Just become a plumber, or it's sort of easier. So it is it's a vocation, and it's really hard. Now this slide shows what we would call a product development or research pathway. And if we think along the top first, there's 2 different sorts of ways of describing it. The top bar is what we call a clinical research pathway. So you've got your basic research in the laboratory, and then you perhaps you prototyping it, testing it out. Then the preclinical development is where you try it out on volunteers, healthy volunteers. And then if you've got ethics, you might then do what we call an early stage clinical trial, maybe with just 6 or 10 people, to see if it works or not, and you'll modify the equipment or whatever. And then if it works, you'll do a later stage clinical trial, perhaps in the hospital, and then you'll launch a product. So you can see that basic preclinical development might take 5 years, and then the next later stage may take 3 to 5 years, and it can typically take 2 to 3 years to launch the product or service. Now, the scale along the bottom, TRL, stands for technology readiness level, and this is very often used more for academic or university work where you're working in the laboratory. So you can see up to TRL level 3, you're basically working with the thing on the laboratory bench. It might be a load of wires connected to batteries, or it might be cells in a culture disc or whatever. So you've got your early lab work, and then you've got your proof of concept. Maybe you take it out, try it and test it in some way. Maybe if it's animal studies, it could be animal studies, or you maybe just test it on some volunteers. But you can see by level, what we call TRL level 5, you've got your technology that's ready to be used on humans, on people, usually in the laboratory in the university. Now, I can tell you that probably only about 1 in 20 research projects, and maybe less than that, get through to TRL level 5. So a lot of research studies that are funded just fall away by the wayside. The initial hypothesis doesn't work, the technology doesn't work, or they run out of resources, it costs more than expected. So, 1 in 20 wouldn't be at all, is not, is a reasonable guess for that. So you can see that then TRL level 6 and 7, we've completed primary and secondary trials. We've looked to see about whether it's safe, and we've got regulatory approval, which I'll talk about in a moment. So probably at that TRL level 7, only 1 in 40 of the ideas will get through to that stage, maybe less. And then as we finish all the necessary data to show that the product works, and you've got your regulatory approval, and you've got your marketing, you've got some commercial manufacturer to take it on, or maybe you're going to set up a company to get it onto market. That's TRL level 9. So perhaps only 1 in 80 innovations are going to get through to that stage. And that's almost in a way the simplest bit, because if you see, I've got this cloud here, adoption. It's one thing putting a product on the market. It's another thing entirely a hospital buying that product, or a doctor using that product, or a nurse using that product. That's a different story entirely. And so you've got to convince them that it's an improvement over what the existing technology or the existing treatments are. And we're going to talk a bit more about that. But typically, only 1 in 200 or something like that inventions or research is going to get through to actually being adopted and used in hospitals. And as you can see, that might take 10 years. Does that all make sense? Any thumbs up? Any questions at this point?
It's a very long journey and a lot. What happens to all the things that fall at the wayside? Is that because they weren't good enough, or money runs out, or?
Yeah, all of those reasons.
Okay.
But generally, you would publish a paper, not always, but generally you would publish a paper. Thank you for the thumbs up. You would publish a paper saying we tried this and it didn't work, or we tried this and it worked a bit,
Okay.
but actually it wasn't good enough to take forward.
So if people
Unfortunately,
wanted, they could look at your research, see what didn't work, to do something new based on that kind of thing.
yeah. Unfortunately, and of course the scientific journals are not very good at this. People don't want to publish stuff that doesn't work.
Hmm.
But we know that in life, things that don't work are some of the best learning lessons, aren't they?
Yeah. Yeah.
So it is a problem.
Yeah.
Now for medication, so I've not done any medicine development, but I just wanted to share this with you because I know a lot. Most of us do take some sort of medicine as we get older. This is the pathway for medicines. So you've got the early preclinical, that's on the laboratory bench in the test tube, or using cells, or some very basic stuff. And then phase 1 trials are where it's gone from the bench. Usually it will involve some animal study. You will then say, okay, we think this drug is now safe to use on humans. And typically they will recruit 10 or 30 participants. Often they're students who are paid. But you could, any of us could volunteer if they were takers and you want to take the risk, and they'll pay you £200 or something like that to go into the research centre for the day and have this infusion or take this drug and be monitored. Once that's complete, they'll do what we call phase 2. Well, they'll start to increase the numbers. Maybe they'll just tweak the way the drug's given slightly, and they'll work with more people. And then they'll look at the longer term follow-up to make sure there's no side effects. And then when that's ready, they'll do what's called a phase 3 clinical trial. And that could be in a hospital where they'll start to recruit people to specific trials, again, follow them up really carefully. And then they'll submit that through to the regulatory authorities for approval before the drug is released for trials. Okay. And we know in COVID, normally this pathway would take 10 or 15 years. But we know that during COVID, when we were under that immense pressure, the companies used some existing vaccine technology, and they were able to accelerate this process literally and squeeze this into a year because they got existing data that the vaccines were safe, and there was a tremendous need to get the vaccines out for people with COVID. And that was really a remarkable achievement to get that through, those vaccines through so quickly.
Does that mean that now vaccines are getting through quicker and stuff's getting through quicker, or is that just a fluke, a one-off because of the pressure, do you think?
No, the underlying, we've now got the underlying technology in place to make vaccines much quicker, more quickly.
Okay.
And you've probably heard of RNA vaccines. So a vaccine there's two components in a vaccine. One is the thing that needs to get it into your body, which is like the vehicle, and then the second is the bit that actually activates your antigens, that the antibodies, the bit that's specific for the disease. And by the RNA vaccines, what they've been able to do is they've got the vehicle. So the stuff that the vaccine is in that they can inject into you, but they've also got the technology with the sequencing and making up RNA vaccines to put together very quickly sequences of RNA that will activate the body's immune system.
Okay.
So we've now got technology available that will allow us quite quickly to make new vaccines.
Okay. But that's different than drugs. So new, for example, stroke drugs and stuff will still go through that 10-year kind of.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
So this is, you can see that what we've got is effectively, it's like a whole series of steps to get an innovation from the basic stages through to a hospital use in a hospital. And these are some of the headings. So you've got whether it's the industry, you've got the research fundings, the National Institute for Health Research, which is the NHS research. You've got innovation networks. You've got Medicines and Healthcare Regulatory Authority, clinical research networks, National Institute for Clinical Excellence, and then NHS bodies that will try and accelerate the adoption, and get those technologies out into hospitals. So let's just unpack some of those a little bit. So who funds research and development? So you've got at the bottom, it's a slightly different headings, but it's the same in theory. You've got basic research, the transitional development, that's the that's the laboratory stage. Yeah. Clinical evaluation, got implementation, that's actually getting the innovation out into hospitals to try, and then you've got adoption and spread. So let me just explain that a little bit. so I mentioned it earlier. So it's one thing having, let's say, a piece of equipment, let's say a robot surgeon. It's one thing having the robot surgeon, the robot being developed and saying, yes, it's safe. Yes, it can do prostate operations really well. It's another thing entirely whether the hospital has got the money to buy it, whether the surgeon, the urology surgeon, wants to use that robot technology or not. And that's called adoption and spread. And we know that what one piece of equipment in one hospital, let's say North Bristol, Southmead, not, if you go to Swindon, they may have slightly different ways of doing things. They'll have different surgeons, they'll have different ways of doing things. And so you don't really know straight away whether that equipment's going to get the same results in Swindon as it did in Bristol. And that's called the adoption and spread. And that's around building up the evidence around the effectiveness. So you can see, starting from the top, we've got these bodies called the UK Research and Innovation, the Engineering and Physical Sciences Research Council, the Medical Research Council. These all fund this early stage research. And then we've got some NHS research schemes that you can see here that will fund the clinical evaluation to look and see how well the innovation actually works. And then there are other funding schemes that help with the implementation, and then what we call the adoption and spread, and sort of getting the innovation out around the whole of the NHS. And the angel investors are people with money in the bank who want to invest in early stage research, and they're looking for good ideas that they can put their money in and get tax relief. And you've also got venture capital people, banks with which take investments, and industry, which are also looking to fund new innovations. And an academic researcher in a university who's developed something very often will try and attract an angel investor or a venture capital investor to take their innovation from the laboratory and help them get it out into a product. And that's a very high risk and a very difficult thing to do. And it's one reason why a lot of good research in universities never makes it out of the university, because there's no money to invest to take it into a product, sadly. So you can't make a health device in your garage, put a label on it and market it as Harris's electrical Zappo that will cure your whatever. All medical products that go on the market have to be approved by the Medicines and Healthcare Regulatory Products Agency, and that also includes medicines, test equipment, etc. So if you're going to make a medical device or a drug or anything for treating for health needs, you have to have approval from the MHRA. I'm not going to go through all the responsibilities. You can see them listed there. So what this means in practice is that once you have got your, let's say you're making a piece of equipment for stroke rehabilitation, once you've tested it in the university, in the department and on the laboratory, if you want to then take that piece of equipment and trial with some patients from Southmead, from the stroke unit, you will have to apply to the Medicines and Healthcare Regulatory Agency to say, we've developed this rehabilitation product. This is how we've done it. This is what it consists of. This is the box. This is the labeling. These are the instructions. This is how we know it's safe. This is the risk assessment to show it's not going to hurt anybody. Is it okay for us to trial this product, that's not on the market yet, this test product? Is it okay to trial on 10 or 20 or 30 people who've had stroke? And so you have to go through that process in order to get approval to do that test. And all the manufacturers with early stage drugs or early stage equipment will have to go through that process. And when you've gone through and got the results from the trial, you'll then go back to them and say, these are the results from the trial. It shows it's effective. There were no problems with it. It's safe. We would like to put it on the market. Do we have approval to do that? And they will also then give you approval to put that product on the market. as you might imagine, the approval process varies significantly depending on the technology. So if it's a simple piece of, let's say, what we call assistive technology, so a new style wheelchair, there's not a lot in evaluating and getting that product onto the market. But if you were bringing a heart pacemaker, something that's going to be implanted in somebody on the market, you can imagine that the regulatory approvals and all the steps necessary to show it's safe is massive, and it's going to take a very long time to put that together, maybe 3 or 4 years to get that package of work together to get approval. Once the product's on the market, and we've talked a bit about this, we've got our robot for prostate surgery, as I said, example. You can put it on the market, and you can publish a paper saying we've trialed it on 30 patients, and this has shown great results. But clinicians around the country may not buy it. And what they often rely on is the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence, the NICE, to evaluate the product. So what they will do is look at the paper that you've published. They will look at other papers around the world from robotic surgery, for example, and they will make a recommendation, and they will say, well, yes, the paper looks sound. We think this does have benefit. It will help patients get discharged from hospital a day earlier. It will save X amount of money. And this could be the same with a drug as well. And we recommend it being used. So it's really important to get your innovation reviewed by NICE and to get a recommendation for it to be used. And that's a very significant step for getting your research out and your product adopted by hospitals around the UK or around the world, actually. If you've developed something in the UK, it's used by the NHS and it's got NICE approval, that's a great package to take to America or to Europe and say, this innovation is being used in the NHS. It's a great thing. We've got the evidence. So let's just change tack slightly. And where does the money for research funding come from? So if we look at the graph on I don't know if it's your right or left, if you look at the big cheese, you can see that the business, so that's pharmaceutical companies, typically account for about 50% of all research funding. And then you can see next up is the universities at 36%, and then public sector research, so that's like NHS research, that's around 8%. So that's where most of the research takes place. So you can see half of it takes place in industry. And how much money does that equate to? So if you look on the graph with the smaller pieces, you can see that's 4,500 million. So that's 4.5 billion pounds. I think that's right. 4.5 billion pounds each year is spent on industry by the pharmaceutical industry on drugs development and equipment development. So they're by far the biggest investor in research funding. And then next up, you can see the pink, which is the Medical Research Council, which is funded by government effectively. You've then got Cancer Research UK, 442 million. And then the next is other government funding schemes of 332 million. So that's where the money comes from. So people in universities, for example, are bidding to the government, to the MRC or Cancer Research or whatever, for that money for their research.
Can I just ask, is that just for pharmaceuticals, for drugs, or is that for all types? Like we've seen things like robotic arms and all sorts of stuff like that. Does that cover everything?
Yeah, it's called life sciences. So that would yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. So I've got a question for us to think about and we can use your chat button. How should we decide how much research funding should go to each disease? Okay, so there's a limited amount of funding available. Yeah. We know that cancer research, for example, they advertise on TV and lots of money, cancer affects most families at some stage. So a lot of us may give to Cancer Research UK and that will fund that work directly with cancer. But if we're thinking about government funding or the what we call the research councils, how do you think we should decide how much money should go to each disease? John says, yeah. Right, yeah. So there's a good point from John about use of drugs to treat stroke involuntary member. By the number of in the population affected. Thanks, Peggy. That's a good one. How else should we decide?
I would say the same as Peggy. The need, what's
Yeah,
the
yeah,
current need for it?
yeah, yeah,
I guess there's another thing with, well, it's difficult, isn't it? How effective the drug will be to treat a number of people. So even if there's, I don't know, 1,000 people, but 1,000 people with a disease, but this particular thing could help only 10% of those, or could this particular thing help 100% of those,
yeah, yeah. Those are really good answers. And actually, and I'll show you in a minute, what actually in practice what happens is that there are a number of high priority areas that are identified. So we know, for example, mental health, we know stroke, obesity, diabetes. We all know those are big key areas. Yeah. So any funder is going to look favorably on any applications in those areas. But in practice, the actual amount of funding depends on the number of good applications. So if researchers are not putting in good applications for those, then they're not going to get funded. So if they have, let's say, 20 applications for mental health and they're all good proposals, it's likely all 20 of those are going to be funded. Now, there are companies that have analysed the breakdown of funding, and what we've got here is and what they've done is they've suggested, and your answers about the numbers of people affected is really good. Is what they've looked at is the number of what's called disability adjusted life years for different diseases. So what you've got down on this side is you've got skin, respiratory, reproductive and health and childbirth. So the brown bar is the number of disability adjusted life years that caused by that disease. So if it's a disease, you can see cancer at the very bottom, near the bottom there, look, as a massive percentage. So the most cancer has the most impact in terms of reducing people's quality of life, producing disability and reducing their life expectancy. Yeah. And then what you've got in the pink is the actual spend in the UK on research in that area for 2022. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So if you look at cancer, the pink is actually very close to the number of disability life years. Yeah. But let's look at blood, cardiovascular and stroke right at the bottom. And you can see that stroke only gets 7% of funding, but it's actually responsible for 13% of the disability adjusted life years. So the actual amount of money given to stroke research, if you were using this as the way of deciding how the funding should be allocated, stroke, cardiovascular only gets half the amount of funding that it should get, given the
But
levels of
infection gets loads.
yeah, the infection gets loads. Yeah.
Yeah. Ragbeer also said in the chat there about should take it in, I think, which ties into this, age. So things that will affect people for longer of their life. And I guess that's what you're saying here, that if
Yes.
if things affect you for a long period of time, then that's yeah.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Okay, to move on. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry.
So you need to fingers on the keyboards again. So what do you think good research is? So what would you say good research is? So any ideas? What would you say is good research? What are some characteristics of good research?
I'll hold my tongue until some other people put out there. But I'll try and hold my tongue. I'm not very good at doing
Hmm.
that.
What would you
Well
say? Good,
tested, I would say, but I
well
think
tested.
judging on what you've just told us and all of that, it is quite stringent, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah. But also think of the infrastructure. Remember, I talked about the research pathway and the ethics and all the rest of it. Think about the wider thing. What things you need it to have in place to do. What things do you need to have in place to do good research?
Uh, Someone's put in the chat about a reduction of mortality
Mortality
rate.
rate. Yeah,
So
that's good.
yeah,
Yeah, that would be good research. Yeah. Okay. I'm going to go through some suggestions then. So yeah,
innovative stuff,
yeah,
not
yeah,
good, you
yeah.
know.
That's a good one, John. Yeah. So here are some ideas that I've picked up, and there's no right necessarily right answer. We're all members of the public. Our taxes all go to fund some of this research, so we've all got a view on this. So you've got a view on this as well as me. So it responds to real need and improves quality of life and reduces health inequality. Is it well planned and conducted and shared with people and communities that the research is aiming to help? Does it draw on the knowledge and experience of people with lived experience, other researchers, clinicians, and wider networks? Does it produce results that are going to be impactful and can be generalized for the benefit of the whole population? And what that means is, it means that if you've developed a health innovation in Scotland for treating people in Scotland, does it just work for people from Scotland, or does it work for everybody everywhere? That's a simple way of thinking about it, generalizable. And is it good value for money? A realistic Gantt chart application, yeah, very good. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, and again, AI, John's commented that AI tools can help people write good research proposals. And the same goes actually for evaluating research proposals. So it's potentially a game changer, which we've not grappled with, but that's a whole separate talk. So, and conducted in an ethical and safe manner. So, just thinking about, why what drives academics or researchers to follow a particular research path. And I want to introduce this idea to you about technology push and market pull. So technology push is like the example on the left with the guy with the virtual reality goggles on, in that we've got VR headsets which can be used to provide virtual environments which can be really useful, for example, for rehabilitation, and for treating mental health and other problems. But because the technology is available, lots of people are thinking, "Oh, great! I can use these VR goggles. I can use them for this and this." And we saw this a lot actually with mobile phones when smartphones came out. We got lots of researchers were using smartphone apps, which we all take for granted now, for monitoring your diabetes, for helping with your mental health, for helping exercise. So that's an example of how a technology becomes available, and it's being, then people think, how can I use this to improve people's health? And of course, the big example at the moment is AI, is artificial intelligence. People are thinking the tool's available, it's just become available. How can we use that to help people's health? And they're looking at all sorts of applications. So that's called technology push. Then the other example is what's called market pull. And we saw this really well illustrated during COVID. So we had masses of people being affected by COVID, very high death rates, challenges about reducing infection, about vaccination, and that was called market pull. Yeah. And that market pull, that need to do something to improve people's health outcomes during COVID, resulted in lots of innovations. And so you've got this balance, and you've got these two, and I'm not saying one is better than the other, but you've got these two ways of thinking about how you would drive research. Some just interesting notes in the chat there. The NHS also has priorities for health, and this is quite a complicated slide, but I'll talk you through it. This is called what they call the Core 20+5, So they've identified 5 areas where there are significant health inequalities. And health inequality means that somebody in one part of Bristol, for example, may have no asthma at all or hardly any asthma. Maybe there's 1 case per 1,000 people. And you might go to the centre of Bristol and it's 10 cases per 1,000 people. And that's called a health inequality. And there are a number of conditions in the Bristol area and other parts of the country where there are significant health inequalities. So asthma is one, diabetes is another, epilepsy is another. 4 is oral health, so that's children and people having had teeth out because they can't get they can't get treatment, or they've got more tooth and gum disease, and mental health. So those are 5 areas where there are known areas of health inequalities, plus problems for the most deprived, problems that are most affect the most deprived areas in the country. And there are areas of deprivation in Bristol, and that may mean health conditions associated with poor nutrition. So not having enough fruit and vegetables, unfortunately, or poor accommodation leading to asthma and stuff like that. So this is how the NHS, for NHS funding schemes, would look at prioritising applications.
Nigel, someone's just asked in the chat, is it, I don't know, and I'm not sure whether you know the answer to this because I think it's quite specific, but is it true that by 2030 AR and AI will be a game changer as we'll have more tools and state-of-the-art health will holographic mapping in identification and resolution? Does that make sense to you? Or is it a bit specific?
It's a bit specific, that one, and I'm not. You have to follow up at the end of the session with that one. I mean, I think we know where areas where lots of people have more diabetes, more strokes, example. The challenge is, and we've got this in the new NHS strategy. The strategy is to move to prevention.
Yeah.
So rather than treating people with the stroke once they're in hospital, which may or may not be successful, it's about encouraging healthy lifestyles, eating, not smoking, not being too overweight, that's going to prevent the incidence of stroke, and treating high blood pressure. So what we want to do is move much more to the prevention, and that is really hard to do. If any of us have gone on diets or exercise programs, or many of you are stroke survivors, you know how hard it is to implement a new thing in your life, and that's really hard to make lifestyle changes, because as humans we're not very good at doing something in the short term, in the long term, that's going to improve an outcome.
Yeah, there's something there about people from different ethnicities as well. And John, you're right. And I think particularly in Bristol, there seems to be a real push in trying to engage people from different ethnicities in research and specific research projects around that. I know we've been approached and helped some people access those from UWE in recent years.
Yeah, and I've got an example of that coming up. And I need to watch the time as well, Gemma.
Yes, we've probably got about another 10 minutes or so, I would say.
Right, okay. So I'll move a bit quickly through this. So I mentioned ethics. So you can't just go ahead with a trial. All research studies are completely, very tightly regulated if they're using human subjects. So at the university at UWE, for example, I even just wanted to go and consult people with dementia about use of robotic technology, and they said I had to have university ethics approval to do that. So I had to write down what I was going to do, the questions I was going to ask, how I was going to use the robots before I could go out and talk to people. If you're in the NHS, you cannot do any research without getting your research approvals and ethical approvals. It's a disciplinary offence. So all the research is really tightly regulated and overseen to make sure it's appropriate and it's ethical. Now, a couple of weeks ago, we had a research network meeting, as I mentioned, and we got some presentations. And I'm just quickly, for the last 10 minutes or so, I'm going to run through the presentations, and I'm going to ask you, first of all, I've got a presentation from the stroke team at the RUH. and they shared some of the clinical trials that were ongoing at the RUH. And a lot of these will also be running at Southmead as well, and there'll be some other ones at Southmead. So Gecko is a people after stroke are at risk of deep vein thrombosis, and very often you may know that's treated with pressure cuffs, air inflated pressure cuffs on the lower limbs or stockings. And Gecko is an electrical stimulation device. So you put little electrodes and you've got a little box and you activate it and it makes your muscles twitch in your legs. And so there's a trial to see if that's as effective as using the stockings and the inflatable socks. There's a speech and language study about how speech and language recovers. There's Teach 3, so I had to look this up. This is tranexamic acid, and basically it helps the blood to clot, and they use it after major accidents or in the military, and looking at is it effective for people who have hemorrhagic strokes. So if you have a bleed on the brain, is this effective in reducing the impact of that? This is stimulation at the back of the throat to help swallowing. This is a drug, Milvexian. I had to look that one up. Oh, this is an oral anticoagulant. So unlike warfarin, where you have to have an injection, do you?
Yeah, the warfarin's kind of being it's the bans. It's another ban. It's rivaroxaban and all of those. They tend to replace warfarin over the last few years. So this is going to be another one of those, I guess.
Yeah. Then the SMART, which is a risk assessment tool for people, a risk of stroke for people who have migraines, symptoms, or TIAs. And then the last one is this is the drugs that improve blood flow. These are nitrates that are used often for heart failure or angina, and can they help outcomes for people with lacunar stroke, which is a particular area of the brain. So those are the clinical trials that are ongoing at the RUH, and these are all funded by pharmaceutical companies, mostly pharmaceutical companies, although there's some devices, commercial companies probably, and these are phase 3 large studies looking to see if these technologies and drugs are beneficial. Now, I'm going to run through quickly 4 projects that were presented at our stroke research meeting. And I'm going to ask you to do this exercise at home. So I've given some notional costs for these studies. I think they're probably about right, but I'm not 100% sure. So don't quote me on these for the recording. And what I'd like you to think at home is, would you say these are high, medium, or low impact? And would you say they were good value for money or not? Okay. And I'm going to ask you at the end, we can't do a breakout group. I'm going to ask you at the end, if you could only fund one of these, which one would you fund? All right. So I'm going to run through them quickly. So the inclusivity and stroke management support was carried out by a number of universities. And basically, as we've said in the chat, that Black people are of higher risk around stroke, and they're less likely to be prescribed statins to reduce the cholesterol or reach their blood pressure targets. And we know that the reports that people from BME backgrounds have lower satisfaction with relationships with healthcare providers than white patients. And this means that Black Caribbean communities actually are very reluctant to go to health professionals for help, and they've got very low expectations around the services that they're going to receive, which is just not right at all. So the project aimed to look at improving, to provide resources to help people self-manage stroke from the Black community and to reduce the inequalities associated with stroke amongst that. And you can see the objectives there, barriers and facilitators for self-management, priority areas for information and advice, to co-design 2 resources. one for Black people living with stroke to help them manage their condition, and one for health and care professionals to improve self-management support. So the project had a discovery phase where they talked to 20 Black people living with stroke, and they got their experiences, and we heard about some of the interviews, which were really quite shocking, the way some of those people had been overlooked and not given the treatment they should have had, and how that affected them. And then that community was then and they engaged with health professionals as well to get their views on this. And then they did some work with co-design with the first film around self-management, and the co-design of the film 2 for health professionals. And those 2 films are now just recently being made available. And I can give you the link to the website, or you can just Google it. And those films are now available, helping people from Afro-Caribbean communities to manage their self-manage better, and targeting health professionals to listen more carefully to people from Afro-Caribbean backgrounds about their experiences, and to try and improve the quality of healthcare that they receive. So that was one project. Then we had a second project from Vanexia, who works in the digital health team at the University of Bristol. And she was doing a study, and her team are using electronic health records, so all our health records, and we can opt in or out of this. And you can see that she was looking at is there an association between stroke and those who had COVID, and does vaccination make a difference? And you can see, using health records, you've got massively powerful data. You've got very big data. Look, pre-vaccination data from 18 million people, 14 million people vaccinated, and 3 million people unvaccinated. So the team were able to look at the anonymized health records of us. I guess my data was in there somewhere, and look around the incidence of stroke and whether vaccinations made a difference. And we haven't really got time to go into this, but basically I want you to just look at the bottom. The hazard ratio is the likelihood of having an ischemic stroke. And what I want you to look at is the unvaccinated, which is the blue line here. So they can see that drop from 8, the hazard ratio of 8, so that's 8 times more to over 8 months, that dropped. But you can see that those who were vaccinated started off at 2, so they're only twice as much times likely to have a stroke, and that dropped off similarly over the 8 months after COVID. So you can see that people who were vaccinated did have a reduced likelihood of having a stroke. And then the third study, this was using a little wrist and elbow worn trackers to monitor your upper limb movement. And basically this was used with a box that was like a gaming experience, as you can see from the picture. So this was to encourage somebody post-stroke to do the upper limb exercises. So they would lift the small weight there, and the monitor would look at how well they were doing. They had to match the pictures on the screen, and in this encouraged the participants to do their upper limb stroke rehab exercises. There were 2 phases to the research. Phase 1 was what we call co-design. So that was developing the screens and how the system would work and how the feedback would be given. And then the stage 2 was what we call a feasibility study around Bristol, so using physios in the community, and that was recruiting 70 people post-stroke to use the rehab equipment over 6 or 8 weeks to see if their upper limb and arm movements improved. Rob, who was presenting, could only just give the very early results because they hadn't fully analysed them yet, but he shared about how effective the kit was at encouraging people to do their exercises. He talked about some of the challenges about setting up and using the equipment and how some people did have technical issues. He talked about how people really liked having to be able, the ability to be able to do physical exercises and see how they were doing, and be able to do those any time of the day or night, rather than just wait for the physiotherapist or just wait working from photocopied sheets. And they also got suggestions for improvement from the system. This is work in progress. So they'll be publishing the results of the interviews around the findings, around what people thought about the system. And then they'll be doing the analysis of what we call the qualitative results. So basically, they will be looking to see how much people's upper limb function improved using the Evolve Rehab system. And that may or may not, we'll have to see the results. It may provide evidence for the benefit of using these home rehab systems, either with or instead of having a physiotherapist. Okay. And then the final research project I want to share with you was from Praveen, who's a physiotherapist at UWE. And he was looking at can you encourage exercise programs in community care settings? And of course, this started with COVID, when people couldn't go into nursing homes, but it's still quite challenging going into care homes and interacting with people. This picture here on the left are what we call telepresence robots. So if you've got one of these, it's a bit like an iPad on a stick, and you can run Zoom, and you can basically, somebody remotely can control this, so you can move around the room and you can hear and see people. And it's really a very effective way of communicating, instead of us being sat here this afternoon in front of a fixed screen, for somebody to be able to move around and interact. They've all got good speakers, so you can engage with people. So the aim was to look and see if these digital technologies, these telepresence robots, could be used in care homes, and could they be used remotely by a therapist to deliver a rehabilitation and exercise program. So Praveen showed pictures of people in the care homes, and people were sat down or stood around, and there's a telepresence robot in the middle, and the therapist instructor was giving instructions to people and watching people, do their upper limb exercises and sit to stands. And what they found was that the telepresence robots were quite effective at doing this, but that the care and support staff needed to have training about how to use and best use the telepresence robots. And there were one or two concerns about just some of the safety and technical challenges. So obviously you don't want the robot running around loose in the middle of a hall if somebody lost control. And obviously you need good Wi-Fi and internet connection to be able to use them. But on the whole, they did show that it was a positive experience and beneficial. So as I said, I've made up some costs for the studies. So I think it was around 120,000. It's quite a big project. It's very hard interviewing people and quite costly making films. As the public health team looked at all those millions of health records. The community team did the home stroke rehab, and then the slightly lower cost telepresence robot exercise program. So what I'd like you to think is, if you could only fund one of these, we haven't got time for a full discussion, which one would you fund? So let's go for 1, 2, 3, or 4. So would you like to put that in the chat?
John might have put, he's already put home stroke in there.
Yeah.
Yeah, and another one for home stroke. It's very interesting. I'm glad someone's done the research on the COVID, though, because I've heard a lot of people talk about that. So that was interesting to hear about. Another one, number 3 there, so the home stroke. I guess it's around the maximization of your recovery, I guess.
Yes.
Which is that one.
Yeah.
But then again, I would err on 1, because you could prevent strokes happening in the first place if people were better engaged. If
Yeah,
there's a higher
yeah,
prevalence of people having
yeah.
stroke from BME communities, you might even prevent some of these happening
Well,
in the first.
you would, yeah, yeah. I mean, I think marginally, I would vote. Having heard the presentations, I personally would vote for one, even though I'm a technologist and have developed these sorts of home rehab. I'll tell you, and you remember how I talked about the challenges of the adoption and spread and getting the product to market. So that home stroke rehab system has been developed by a Spanish company. It's on the market. Gone through all the approvals, etc. They don't know if they're going to market it in the UK. They don't know if there's enough demand in order to market it in the UK. So it might not be available, which would be really sad, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Right. So just finally, two more slides and then we're done. If you're interested in taking part in research, the NHRB part of research, you can just pop it into your browser. They have research registries where you can actually look at national research going on, and you can look and see if there are studies in your area. And I just had a very quick look for stroke in Bristol, and you can see there are 19 studies found for stroke in Bristol, and you can do it yourself and go down and look at them. But there's just a couple there that came at the top. You can see there. So if you're interested in taking part in research, you can use that tool and see if you're eligible or not.
Greg Beer said something about I was in hospital that many people who had COVID ended up with strokes. I don't think that research has been done yet about uh, COVID on strokes, the effect of COVID on strokes. It's difficult. I've heard that before as well, but no, I don't think there's been any research done into that. So it's hard to say one way or the other. Um, I think Nigel's just frozen there, so I'll just carry on a second. That, yeah, as John has said in the chat, the Stroke Association and the British Heart Foundation often look for volunteers, and we also get approached at Bristol After Stroke for looking for people, and we find it difficult to know what to advertise and what not. So I think what we're going to do is set up a web page and put on there people's small information about the people that come to us, um, and um, then you can look for yourself. But obviously, we can't promote a single piece of research. But in the future, hopefully, it will go on our website. Sorry, Nigel, you froze then, but you
Yeah,
seem back with us now.
yeah.
So that's good. Shall I pause the recording here?
Hmm.
Bear with me a second.